So Bret Stephens, the columnist who's paid by the New York Times to be wrong about things, wrote a column about a thing that he was wrong about. Trump voters, he says. Emily, what did you make of this mea culpa from Bret Stephens, which was part of a series from the Times where their columnists were laying out the things that they've been wrong about?
Yeah, the New York Times published this whole series with columnists from Tom Friedman to Gail Collins to Bret Stephens sort of issuing mea culpas about major things that they'd been wrong about, although Gail Collins took the opportunity to just say she was wrong to talk about Mitt Romney's dog, strapping his dog to the top of the car a bunch of times, which is sort of a cop-out. But this Bret Stephens column, I think
also she's not wrong. Like, that was a horrifying thing for Mitt Romney to have done, and people should still be talking about it. So she's actually wrong now to say that she was wrong then.
But granted, and that's why she's doing a little bit of a cop-out here, what she's saying she was wrong about is writing about it some 80 times. Like, she mentioned it a truly obscene amount of times. And so she's basically just being like, listen, the volume of my complaints about Mitt Romney once strapping his dog to his car was a little off. But the Bret Stephens column, I think it's important to kind of walk and chew gum at the same time with it, which is that this is sort of a fascinating little exercise from the New York Times, because you have Tom Friedman saying he's wrong about Chinese censorship. You have their tech columnist saying he was wrong about Facebook. It's like, oh, great. Now you tell us, 10 years later when you, or Krugman on inflation is another really good example, saying, well, nobody could have predicted supply chain issues or the war in Ukraine. And it's like, actually, some people could have. Matt Stoller tweeted out that, nobody is doing a lot of work here in response to one of Krugman's arguments. But the Stephens column, to walk and chew gum at the same time, it's like, great, I'm glad that you've recognized this now, but it's kind of an astounding statement on the level of competence that the New York Times stable of columnists have. So while I can give them credit for being willing to sort of come out there and talk about it and reflect on their errors, I also think it's a pretty strong indictment. I have this quote up from Bret Stephens where he's talking about how I could have also given Trump voters more credit for nuance. For every in-your-face MAGA warrior, there were plenty of ambivalent Trump supporters, doubtful of his ability and dismayed by his manner, who were willing to take their chances on him because he had the nerve to defy deeply flawed conventional pieties. Okay, so Bret Stephens earlier in the column has this great sort of coming apart, Charles Murray-esque revelation about how he was in a bubble where the status quo was fine, and he missed, he sort of underestimated the intensity of the brokenness and the tearing of the social fabric in other parts of the country because he was in a bubble where the status quo was fine. It's like, dude, all you had to do to hear this perspective from the sort of ambivalent Trump supporters was get out of that bubble. Maybe don't write from your perch in Manhattan about the entire country as an authority on American politics if you're not talking to Republican voters and if you're not talking to voters in general, because I guarantee you, if you had gone down to the super conservative county in Wisconsin that I'm from and went to a single PTA meeting or a bar, you would have found tons of those ambivalent Trump voters in 10 minutes, and that's all it would have taken. So at the same time, I just think this is a big indictment of their level of competence.
And so so let's go through what Bret Stephens is saying here, and what he's sort of apologizing or saying he was wrong about. So he's saying that he was wrong in 2015 to kind of condemn the characters of Trump voters. He says, I was right to condemn the character of Donald Trump. He says, I was right to condemn the character of the people around him, but I was wrong to spread it more broadly to his supporters, because his supporters only had a couple of options, and they wanted to stick a middle finger up to the elites, the protected class, as he calls them, through Peggy Noonan, and this was their vehicle to do that, and I shouldn't disparage them for doing that. Now, I mean, I'd say a couple things. That one, I think it is actually okay to make value judgments about opinions generally. Like, I think that's okay. You can say, like, I think this opinion is wrong. You shouldn't hold it. I think that's fine. But from there, what you need to do is you need to work to persuade people of why that's the case. Because I think once you have millions of people who believe a certain thing, placing a value judgment on it is kind of beyond useless, and actually is probably counterproductive. Like, because at that point, you're in the realm of structural change and structural phenomena that have driven those tens of millions of people to have those views, and you can't just kind of condemn your way out of it. You need to kind of change the structural conditions that created that phenomena. And so I think that's why he's both kind of wrong and right there.
Yeah, it's interesting. He starts by saying the worst line I've ever written as a pundit is, if by now you don't find Donald Trump appalling, you're appalling. What's appalling is that anybody would ever have the instinct to put that in print, to etch that in the sort of digital stone, that you're condemning this wide swath of the country as appalling without, talking. Clearly, he hadn't talked to enough people, period, to render a judgment that severe. And so I think that says a lot, just period. And to your point about structural change, the New York Times is part of that structure, is completely part of that structure. And he sort of reckons with that a little bit. He kind of flirts with the idea of saying, I was confirming the suspicions that were pushing people to Trump. My behavior totally confirmed that narrative and cemented it as accurate. And it's like, okay, so what has changed? Other than you, Bret Stephens, saying, oh, yeah, maybe I was wrong about that in one column. What has changed structurally, not just structurally in the economy, but structurally in the New York Times or in the media? And what have you done to be a part of that structural change that is going to sort of heal some of these wounds? Seriously, what have you done? And that's an totally open question, because there's no good answer to it.
Right. No, he hasn't done anything. But going back to the point about how sometimes it is okay, I think, to make some judgments. So I think the timing here lines up around the time of the Muslim ban, because what are we talking, August 2015?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think if you want to make the point that if you watch Donald Trump, say that he wants to ban all Muslims from coming into the country, and you don't find that appalling, that is appalling. Now, I think what Stephens is missing there is that I think a lot of people who supported Trump also found that appalling. And that's a very contradictory and difficult thing to hold together. And so what it says is that they're in a system that is only giving a couple of different avenues toward their expression of a politics. And they might find what Trump is saying appalling, but they find the things that he's fighting against even more appalling. And so then you have to tease out, individual things. But I think it is okay to say that if you support a ban on somebody coming into the country because of their religion, that's appalling.
But it wasn't
now,
because
whether you're appalling or right.
But I think this is what's so frustrating. People would this is exactly the point. He did not. That is an argument that, for instance, from your perspective as somebody who has an open opinion, which is a lot of reporters purport to be totally neutral, right? Like, they can write with the voice of God, and they referred to it as a Muslim ban. When you can make that argument, you can certainly make the argument that this was on the basis of religion, but that's technically not what he did. He was doing it, he wanted to do it on the basis of national origin, and that's what's frustrating to people, because it makes them distrust media, and it makes them say, this is why I want to vote for somebody who's just going to bulldoze the entire media, because this is not a neutral sort of rendering, and I don't know what to trust anymore. And so I think Stephens interestingly does reckon with that when he says he could have given Trump voters more credit for nuance. Exactly what you said, Ryan, that there's some people who maybe do find that appalling, and absolutely, the same people who voted for Barack Obama, who then voted for Donald Trump, who really had a key influence over the outcome of the election. Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. Although all he would have had to have done is talked to some people to find that. That described so many Republican voters that you could throw a dart. You couldn't miss it in a crowd of people at a Republican rally. But I think it's also really important that just that alone is a good example. When your community is being ravaged by opioids and being ravaged by private equity, the paper mill is closing, whatever it is, the church pews are empty, divorce is really high, all of these problems are rampant. The social safety net has holes in it that are just, it's incapable of catching people. When that's your situation, you're going to care a little bit less when the media is telling you to be worried about something, but they're also sort of doing it in a way that makes it hard for you to understand what's actually happening.
Right. Although I'm not talking about the Muslim ban, which was like you said, February of 2017.
Yeah.
His column is from 2015 when he announced the ban. And here he said he read a statement to his audience saying, quote, Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what the hell is going on, he said.
Okay.
And so he very specifically made it about religion at the time.
Yes.
When the lawyers went to implement it, they're like, yeah, bruh, you can't put Muslim in the executive order. You have to just pick countries that are predominantly Muslim, and then you can try to get away with it. But so
that's a good point. That is completely. No, you're absolutely right about that. I was thinking of the 2017 ban and not the statement from 2015, which was, to your point, very explicit, and that's my bad.
Right, and that's around the time that I think that's around the time that Stevens was running, and here I am defending Stevens, which is the last thing I ever want to do. But my point is that you can, on the one hand, say that that's appalling, and cheering that is appalling. And on the other hand, understand that people have such a depth of anger that they see other things as even more appalling, and then take that understanding and try to deal with the structural phenomena that are causing that hatred. Otherwise, it's going to continue to spin more and more out of control.
Right. And that's like, that obviously wasn't the best case study because I was thinking of the 2017 example, but there were myriad examples of things that Donald Trump said being
right. He would say something and then they would spin it out a little bit further than what he actually said, which he was also happy with that circumstance too. Like it was the media and Trump were kind of feeding off of themselves in that way.
Yeah, and that's a good example. Like what he said on the campaign trail versus what he actually implemented is a case study in the public pressure kind of working. It didn't create the exact policy outcome, but he also didn't issue he didn't end up issuing a literal Muslim ban, even though it's a perfectly fair argument to say that was the consequence of it. So they're two very different things, and the nuance there is important. And I think to your point about how they're always at loggerheads in this sort of theater that was feeding ratings and all of that, it just turned out to be really unhelpful in ways that really deeply, deeply frustrated people. And that's, what's Bret Stephens doing to really fix that other than just sort of shrugging and being like, whoops, I missed it.
Yeah.
I don't know. And the full series, by the way, it's like they're making these big concessions on Chinese censorship, on Facebook, on inflation, capitalism. These are not like minor little, whoops, we got it wrong. We talked too much about Mitt Romney strapping his dog to a car. It's like, oh yeah, no, we were using our platform at the most powerful news outlet in the entire world to mainstream things and legitimize things that we got wrong. This is so funny.
And 80 references to the dog being on the roof, I think, is actually fine. 90,
it's not enough.
100. Yeah, not enough. Take the dog off the roof. What is wrong with you?
Oh, true.
Fundamental indictment.
Just one of Romney's many problems, but we'll be back with more Rising right after this.